Here's a video in which Frank Turek attempts to argue against Stephen Hawking.
We said last night that the evidence leaves us with one of the following two options. If the universe had a beginning, it must have had a beginner. What are our two options? We said number one, either no one created something out of nothing, which is the atheistic view, or someone created something out of nothing, which is the theistic view. Now, my question last night was this: which view is more reasonable? That no one created something out of nothing, or that someone created something out of nothing?
The first statement is poorly phrased and open to multiple interpretations. What Frank probably means when he says no one created something out of nothing is that something was created but not out of anything and not by anyone. That interpretation does sound pretty far-fetched, but it's not what I, as an atheist, believe. There is, however, another interpretation. No one created something out of nothing could mean that nothing which exists was created at all. That's what I actually do believe. To say that something was created implies that there was a time when it didn't exist. Creation involves advancing from a time when something does not exist to a time when it does exist. Was there ever a point in the 13.7 billion year history of time that this universe or some kind of universe did not exist? This doesn't seem to be the case. So I don't think the universe was created out of nothing at all. It wasn't created at all. The universe could not have been created out of nothing because there was never a time when nothing existed. And how does the idea that someone created something out of nothing make any more sense than nobody making something out of nothing? How does someone do that? What would that even mean? How is that view more reasonable?
It's got to be someone, right? And last night we said you can ask who made the someone, but that's certainly more reasonable than no one. No one created something out of nothing, please. Nothing comes from nothing. Nothing ever could, right?
Then how could someone make something come from nothing? If nothing can come from nothing, then saying that the idea that someone made something come from nothing is more reasonable than the idea that nothing made something come from nothing is like saying that it's more reasonable to say that someone makes 2 + 2 = 5 than it is to say that 2 + 2 = 5 all on its own. Both are equally nonsensical.
Hawking was saying, that every cause in the world, in the universe, is the product of a prior natural event. So there are no miracles, there are no exceptions to this. Everything is just a product of a previous natural event. Okay, that's called scientific determinism. What does that imply? First of all, this is a philosophical assertion, not a scientific conclusion. It begs the question in favor of atheism.
It is, in fact, a scientific conclusion. The reason Hawking didn't believe that there are any supernatural interventions is because none are evident or necessary to explain anything. To illustrate this, he quotes the astronomer Laplace, who, when asked by Napoleon where a god would fit into his model of the solar system, said, "I have not needed that hypothesis." At the time, it was thought that the gravity of the planets would eventually throw each other's orbits off, and that a god must be resetting them and keeping them in place. But Laplace discovered that, in fact, the perturbations would be periodic, that is, marked by repeated cycles rather than being cumulative. The solar system would thus reset itself, and there would be no need for divine intervention. That, of course, doesn't prove that there's no such thing as divine intervention, but empirical science proceeds by inductive inference rather than deductive proof. And it is entirely reasonable to inductively infer that since every cause and explanation we've been able to find for anything has turned out to not be supernatural, that the supernatural does not exist. And it doesn't beg the question in favor of atheism. Saying that there are no miracles is not the same as saying there is no God. And even if it did say that, this would only beg the question in favor of atheism if it were intended as an argument for atheism. Scientific determinism is a conclusion from the evidence rather than an argument.
Do you see that this is a philosophical conclusion he makes here? He can't learn this by doing some sort of experiment. This is not a scientific conclusion. This is a philosophical presupposition.
No, it's not a presupposition. It is a post-supposition. It can be very reasonably inferred after looking at the total absence of scientifically confirmed miracles.
He says scientific determinism is true, therefore there are no miracles, therefore atheism is true. How does he know this? Because he said so.
No, that's not the argument. He's not arguing that scientific determinism is true, therefore there are no miracles. You've got it backwards. The inference is the other way around. He doesn't see any miracles, he doesn't need any miracles to explain anything, therefore he inductively infers that there are none, and that scientific determinism is therefore true. Also, he doesn't conclude from this that there is no God. He only concludes that there is no active role for God. Deism would be entirely compatible with scientific determinism.
That's it. I just said so. It's an assertion. There's no evidence for this. This is just a philosophical assertion.
The evidence is that no law that's currently considered a law has ever been confirmed to have been broken. Hawking is not just assuming there are no miracles based on nothing. He's not just pulling this out of his ass. He's very reasonably inferring the absence of miracles from the fact that everything shows every sign of working without them at all.
That's why I said last night, science doesn't say anything, scientists do. And if you're not good at philosophy, you may come up with bad scientific conclusions.
Yes, Frank, you're living proof of that.
And this book that Hawking has written is just loaded with philosophical presuppositions that he can't prove. Atheistic philosophical presuppositions. Suppose some Christian said, miracles do occur. In fact, they happen all the time. And then you ask the Christian why, and he just says, because I said so.
So you want me to imagine a scenario that is not at all analogous to what Hawking was actually saying? Hawking says quite clearly how he comes to the conclusion that scientific determinism is true. He doesn't gloss over it, nor does he say, because I said so.
This also means that Hawking's thoughts in this book are determined. In other words, we have no reason to believe they are true. If every effect in the universe is a product of a previous natural cause, then so are his thoughts. His thoughts are the product of a previous natural cause.
Why would that mean that we have no reason to believe that they are true? If his thoughts about the universe are to any extent determined by the way the universe actually is, then that is evidence in favor of their credibility rather than against it. If, however, we have free will and our thoughts about the universe are free rather than determined by the way it actually is, then they would seem far less credible to me. Why would a mind that is free from the deterministic laws of nature be a more reliable assessor of them than a mind that is determined by those laws? I suppose it's not necessarily the case that a material mind would be better able to make judgments about matter than an immaterial mind, but I see absolutely no reason to infer that an immaterial mind would necessarily have any insight into matter that a material mind would not.
Which means we have no free will, which means he's not really reasoning. What's he doing? He's simply a product of previous natural causes. He doesn't have free will. He's not really thinking. These thoughts are just coming to him because of some brain chemistry going on here.
Why would that render them unreliable? Is a calculator unreliable because it's not really thinking in the sense you mean? Why can't reasoning be a deterministic process? When I'm reasoning, it doesn't feel free. When presented with a valid syllogism, I don't at all feel like I'm freely choosing to accept that its conclusion follows from its premises. I believe that it does because I can't conceive of it not following. I don't see how I can help but believe it.
He's just molecules in motion. If that's the case, why should we believe what he says?
Why couldn't molecules in motion be a credible authority on how molecules move? I get that they wouldn't necessarily be, but I see no reason at all why they couldn't be.
This is what some might say a universal acid that burns everything up. It burns its own theory up. To say determinism is true is to say, well, how did I come to the conclusion that determinism is true? Because I had a previous natural cause it in my mind. Well, how would I know then what I'm really believing is true then? You wouldn't.
Okay, so let's say we have free will, and instead of your thoughts being determined by anything, they rather just pop into your head uncaused. Nothing determined them to be what they just are what they are for no reason. Why would those thoughts be any more reliable?
So he's just given up the entire show here by saying this. How can you be a scientist? How can you discover truth if this is the case? You can't.
Well, first of all, the point of being a scientist is not to discover truth as you seem to use that word. Hawking even says as much in that same book. He endorses a view he calls model-dependent realism, which says that there are multiple ways of interpreting the world that are all scientifically valid despite the fact that we may not be able to discern which of them is exclusively true. He says if two such physical theories or models accurately predict the same events, one cannot be said to be more real than the other. Rather, we are free to use whichever model is most convenient. And when he uses the word free, he doesn't doesn't mean undetermined, but more specifically free from any epistemic obligation. This is actually one of his major points in the book, so it's odd that Frank seems to have missed it. He seems to have only taken points from the book that he wanted to take. Sometimes he read assertions into it that Hawking never made. He thinks the book is or contains an argument for atheism where I certainly don't see one. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.